Do you believe that sometimes the long silence of a man can be shattered in an instant by nothing more than the sound of hoofbeats coming down from a distance? One late afternoon that seemed no different from any other, when the wind carried only dust and the faint smell of smoke clinging to rafters. Fate broke through without warning. It wasn't the crack of gunfire on a street, nor the shout of revenge from some stranger. No, it began more simply the hurried rhythm of a horse charging toward a lonely ranch, a place that had been forgotten by nearly everyone, except the man who had lived there alone for almost 7 years. Before I take you further, let me pause for a moment if these opening words already make your chest tighten, as if a storm is about to sweep in. Go ahead and hit that like button to help keep these Western stories alive. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening? From a wooden porch in the country, or from a small room tucked away in the city? I promise you this, if you ride with me until the end. You'll see why a man who had already lost everything could not turn his back when fate placed another human being at his doorstep. Jonah Ward, that middle-aged man had once worn Union blue, marched into battle, and carried home the price of it, one ear half deaf, his hearing forever dulled. But the battlefield hadn't dealt him the cruelest blow. No, that came from distance, while he was still hundreds of miles away. His wife and newborn son had been carried off by fever. When he returned, all that remained was a silent house and a strip of barren land no one wanted but him. Jonah kept it anyway, clinging to the soil the way a man clings to memory. His life since then was a simple sentence work: feed the cattle, patch the fences, and keep moving so the silence didn't crush him. That evening, Jonah sat on the porch rail, boots propped on the lowest slat. Sunlight bled across cracked earth, dust twisting into ghostly little columns, like familiar spirits passing through. He wasn't waiting for anyone. Visitors had been fewer than raindrops in these parts. But then, like an echo from a past that refused to sleep, he caught the sound of a horse running fast. It wasn't the steady, measured rhythm of a man traveling careful. No, this was reckless, pounding, careless. Jonah stood slowly, his back stiff from years of labor, his hand almost unconsciously brushing the empty space where a gun used to hang. His eyes narrowed toward the cloud of dust rolling closer, and just as he suspected, only one rider came tearing down the trail. Matthew, his son. The boy swung out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. At 20, Matthew carried everything Jonah had once lost: youth, strength, and that wild certainty that the world would bend before him. But what froze Jonah's breath wasn't the reckless way his son rode. It was the rope in Matthew's hand. And at the end of that rope wasn't a steer or a mule. It was a young Apache woman. Jonah's stomach twisted hard. He'd seen plenty of grief in his life, but still couldn't stand the sight of a human being treated like an object. The girl stood there, barefoot in the hard dirt, wrists bound raw and red, chest heaving, her chin lifted high. Dust clung to her long black hair, her deerskin dress torn at the shoulder, exposing her collarbone but her eyes. Her eyes were steady, watchful, as if daring the world to break her. "Pa," Matthew said with a cocky grin, the kind of grin that makes young men believe they're clever. "A gift for you. You've worked yourself near to death out here. Figured you deserved something for yourself." For a moment, all the sounds of the yard fell away. Jonah wasn't a man of quick words, but the sight of that rope cut deeper than any silence ever had. He had grown used to loneliness, but nothing in that loneliness had prepared him for this, a so-called gift in human form, a pair of eyes that asked for no pity, only braced for judgment. Jonah stepped down from the porch, every movement heavy as if weighed by years. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, not the voice of a father scolding a son, but of a man passing judgment. "Matthew, what have you done?" The air fell still, the wind rasping against the old fence rails. And in that silence, Jonah Ward realized his life was about to turn down a road he had never planned. A road paved in shock, in pain, but also carrying the first spark of something he thought long buried the chance that his house might breathe with life again. Jonah Ward clenched his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the rope biting deep into the girl's thin Apache wrists. Those raw red marks pulled up a memory he knew too well. Soldiers he'd once seen dragged through a prison camp, trussed like cattle, their eyes hollow. For years he'd sworn he'd never again watch another human being treated that way. And yet, here it was, brought right to his porch by his own blood. Matthew. "Cut her loose," Jonah said, voice low, rough, but commanding. Matthew stiffened, disbelief flickering across his face. "Pa, I just saved her from a beating in town. If I let her go now, she'll run. You don't know, Cut." The rope, this time the word snapped like a whip. Jonah's anger, pressed down for too long, broke loose in the open air. The knife flashed. One stroke and the rope fell away into the dirt. The girl jerked her hands free, rubbing the sore flesh. But her gaze never left Jonah. They weren't pleading eyes. They were sharp, watchful, almost daring. Jonah drew a deep breath. He knew trust wasn't born from the slash of a knife. It had to be earned, slow and steady, over time. He turned on his son. "If you think I need a gift like this to keep me alive, then you don't know me at all." Matthew's voice rose, angry, defensive. "You've been alone too long. Pa, can't you see that she owes you at least work in return?" Owes who Jonah stepped closer, his stare cold as steel. "She owes no one but her own breath, and God, and you." His voice broke lower, harder. "You just turned a human being into a thing to trade. That's not what I taught you." Matthew's mouth twisted. He said nothing more, swung back into the saddle, and kicked his horse down the trail. The pounding hooves faded until there was nothing left but wind and dust. The ranch fell silent. Jonah turned. The Apache girl still stood there, unmoving, dust in her tangled hair, sweat streaking her neck, her chin tilted high. That silence tightened something in Jonah's chest. He didn't want to pity her. He wanted to recognize her as what she was, a person. "Come in," he said finally, and stepped onto the porch. She hesitated, bare feet planted in the hard earth, eyes wary. Jonah didn't push. He only opened the cabin door, letting lamplight spill out. At last, she followed, silent as a shadow. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and leather oil. Jonah set a plate on the table beans, a chunk of dry bread. He didn't look at her. "Eat." She stood a long moment, eyes suspicious. Jonah moved back toward the stove, giving her space. Hunger won out. She crouched down, eating fast, hands trembling faintly. Every bite looked like a fight between relief and fear it might be snatched away, watching her. Jonah felt something stir more than pity. It was recognition. He too knew what it was to be left with nothing but breath and silence. When the plate was clean, Jonah pointed toward the hearth. "You'll sleep there. I'll fetch a blanket." He laid down an old quilt, then went about banking the fire. Shadows leapt across the walls. The girl pulled the blanket tight, eyes still open, sharp as a cornered bird. Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the wind claw at the boards. In that moment he knew this choice had changed his life. It might bring trouble. It might bring worse. But sending her back, bound and broken, that would have been a sin he couldn't carry. Before sleep came, he laid down the rule to himself she would not be a burden. If she stayed, she would work. This wasn't charity. This was the only way two people could survive together. The fire's glow flickered across the old scar on his face. Jonah let out a long breath and lay back. for the first time in years. The cabin held more than his own breathing, and strangely enough, the silence didn't feel suffocating anymore. There were mornings when Jonah Ward woke to the faint glow of a dying fire, the cabin still heavy with the smell of smoke. He was used to stepping out onto the porch into the biting cold, drawing water alone, splitting wood alone, tending the herd alone. But now, when his eyes opened, something had changed. The silence was no longer his alone. There were small sounds, someone stirring a pot, scrubbing a floorboard, or simply the steady breathing of another soul in the room. Strange as it was, it made the silence easier to bear. Nayeli, the Apache girl, rarely spoke. Sometimes an entire day passed with nothing more than clipped phrases: water, hold the horse, add more wood. But Jonah found comfort in her quiet. He had no need for pretty words. What mattered was presence, the steady rhythm of another life keeping pace with his. Each morning, he led her to the well. He thought at first she might fumble with the heavy bucket, but her small hands proved strong. She hauled it up clean, steady. Not a drop spilled. Jonah didn't praise her aloud, he only gave a small nod. Still, inside, a flicker of respect stirred. In the corral, Jonah hammered at split rails, reset posts that leaned in the wind. He had done this work alone for years. Sweat soaking his shirt, breath sawing in his chest. Now, as he bent to lift a beam or pry out a nail, he caught sight of Nayeli's skirt brushing through the dust, arms full of hay for the stock. She did not shy from labor. When needed, she waded through mud, gathered straw with both arms, even steadied a calf for Jonah to dose with medicine. He found himself surprised, then accustomed, then quietly trusting. Inside the cabin, the changes were most striking. The rough table, scarred and gray with use, now shone from her scrubbing. The ragged curtains were pulled down, cut and stitched into fresh cloth. Jonah would return at dusk, lay his hat aside, and smell bread warming on the stove instead of the must of damp wood. He seldom said thank you. But the way he set his plate down and ate in silence, steady and respectful, was thanks enough. Nayeli, who had grown used to contemptuous stares in town, found his silence different, without pity, without command, only recognition. Evenings, after work, they often sat apart, Jonah with his knife, whittling a new handle or latch, Nayeli by the lamp, her hands quick with needle and thread. Neither broke the silence. Yet the quiet was not the emptiness Jonah had once endured. It was the quiet of two people working side by side, like the slow rhythm of breathing beside a common fire. One night, the wind slammed the shutters, rattling the cabin. Nayeli started, her eyes wide with the old panic of memory. Jonah rose without fuss, braced the shutter, and said simply, "Just the wind." That was enough. Her shoulders eased, her hands steadied. He realized his calm had become her anchor. Another evening, he left her behind while he rode the fence line. Returning, he saw smoke rising from the chimney, beans simmering on the stove, the table set. He stood in the doorway longer than usual, taking it in. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a shell and more like a home. Jonah wasn't a man to put thoughts into words, but deep down he knew this girl wasn't just pulling her share of work. She was giving back to the house a pulse, a soul, and he, a man who had clung so hard to loneliness, was relearning what it meant to live alongside another. That night, he laid extra wood on the fire so it would burn longer. When the flames lit Nayeli's face, he caught her eyes glancing toward him, not guarded, not defiant, but softened, for the first time. There was a quiet hint of sharing, and in that moment, Jonah knew the silence had changed forever. No longer the silence of despair, but the silence of two people learning how to carry life together shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. Perhaps it is the smallest things, the quiet gestures of everyday life, that change the course of fate. For Jonah Ward, transformation didn't come from gunfights or sudden choices. It came from the little things he did for the Apache girl. And in those small acts, day by day, Nayeli ceased to be a stranger kept under his roof and began to become part of the home itself. One morning, as sunlight barely filtered through the cabin window, Jonah noticed her deerskin dress was worn to shreds at the hem, stained with mud. He went to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, rummaged for a long while, and pulled out an old shirt of his and a skirt that once belonged to his late wife. He didn't say a word. He simply set them on the chair near the hearth and went back to his chores. Later, he saw her holding them, eyes flickering with surprise, not at the clothes themselves, but at being treated as a person. That evening, when Jonah returned from the corral, he found Nayeli seated near the lamplight, patiently stitching the skirt with the needle and thread he had left. The seams were neat, firm, the kind of careful work that spoke of pride. Jonah felt a rare smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He didn't speak. He only sat nearby, letting the quiet rhythm of her needle replace the whistling wind outside. When night fell, the frontier cold pressed hard against the walls. Jonah noticed her curled tight under a thin blanket, shivering. Without a word, he fetched another quilt from the chest and laid it down beside her. She pulled it over her shoulders and, for the first time, lifted her eyes to his. Their gaze met not in fear, not in suspicion, but in acknowledgement. Jonah gave a small nod. It was the nod of a householder, perhaps even of a father. But most of all, it was one human being affirming another. Then came the winter storm. Wind screamed against the shutters, battering them so hard the cabin quaked. Nayeli startled, clutching her blanket until her knuckles turned white. Jonah steadied the latch, his voice calm and steady. Just a storm. It'll pass. Those few words were enough. Her shoulders eased, her breathing slowed. For the first time, she felt safe in his presence. In the days that followed, the change deepened. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter of last resort. It became a place to live. Every corner bore her touch, the curtains stitched, the table scrubbed clean, the bedroll folded neat. Jonah, a man long accustomed to dust and disorder, found himself surprised at the comfort her care created. He never said it outright, but every time he stepped in from the cold to find a fire waiting, a pot simmering, or a cup of coffee set aside for him, a weight lifted from his chest. It wasn't service he craved. It was the quiet knowledge that someone saw him. Someone shared the burden of keeping a home alive. One night, as she trimmed the wick on the lamp, Jonah found words he rarely spoke. "Thank you." Just 2 syllables. Yet her eyes softened, her lips curving with the faintest trace of warmth. In that moment, Jonah knew with certainty she was no longer a prisoner here. They still spoke little, but in each shared task, in each day's labor, something deeper settled between them. He no longer saw her as a burden. She no longer saw him as a threat. Instead, they began to see each other as 2 souls keeping a fragile sanctuary alive together against the wind. Small things, a shirt, a needle, a blanket, a steady word in a storm had stacked like bricks, building a rhythm of life. And in that rhythm, a quiet respect took root. On a late winter night, Jonah sat carving a new tool handle while Nayeli sewed a curtain by the window. The lamplight caught her face, calm and intent on her work. And in that moment, Jonah understood his cabin was no longer just a place to sleep. It had become a home because someone else was there, sharing it, keeping it alive beside him. News travels faster than the wind. On the frontier, a rumor could ride a horse 10 miles in half a day. And soon after, Nayeli began to be seen at the ranch, drawing water at the well. Tending cattle beside Jonah, whispers stirred in town. To them, a white man living with an Apache girl was never just private business. It was fuel for every prejudice. She's a thief. She runs with raiders. He's hiding something. Jonah knew the day would come, but when hoofbeats broke across the yard that noon, his chest tightened all the same. 3 riders came down the trail. At their head was Sheriff Briggs, broad-shouldered, gray in his beard, stiff-backed as an oak. Behind him rode 2 ranchers from nearby spreads, men never short of sneers when whiskey loosened their tongues. Jonah stepped out onto the porch, bracing one hand on the post. Inside the cabin, Nayeli stood just behind the door. He didn't need to look to know her eyes were on his back. Her breath caught in waiting. "Ward," Briggs said, tipping his chin, his voice steady as rolling stone. "There've been complaints. Folks say you've got an Apache girl here." That true Jonah folded his arms, his eyes sharp as a drawn blade. "True. She's here. And she's safe. One rancher spat into the dirt. Safe she's Apache. Briggs, remember those raids last spring? Could be she held the torch herself." Jonah stepped down off the porch, boots crunching in the frost. His voice stayed low, but each word landed like a hammer. "She works this place, cooks our meals, keeps the cabin, tends the stock same as me. She earns her keep with sweat. That's all the judgment I'll allow." Briggs narrowed his eyes. He wasn't a man to yield easily, but Jonah's stare carried a weight hard to argue with. "You know what this means, Jonah. Folks in town don't like it. They say justice ought to stand. A thief's a thief," Corn Jonah barked a bitter laugh. "A starving girl takes a few years to stay alive, and the town would string her up for it. Then that kind of justice is nothing but a joke." The sheriff was silent a long beat, then turned in the saddle toward the ranchers. "You heard him. She's no trouble now. Jonah's taking responsibility." The men grumbled, curses slipping under their breath, but when Briggs motioned them on, they turned their horses and rode back down the trail, dust rising behind them. The yard grew still again. Briggs lingered just a moment, his voice lower now. "I won't press it, Ward, but you understand what line you've drawn. Once it's drawn, you don't get to step back." Jonah's jaw worked. He looked past the sheriff to the horizon, then back, his voice steady. "I understand. And I've made my choice. She stays. That's mine to decide, no one else's." When the riders were gone, the silence wrapped the ranch once more. Jonah turned and found Nayeli standing in the doorway, hands clenched so tight they shook. Yet her face was calm, her eyes clear and strong. "They'll come again?" she asked quietly, testing him. "Maybe," Jonah admitted, climbing the porch steps. "But I won't hand you over. This is my home, and from now on, it's yours too." Her shoulders eased at that. The pride in her gaze didn't fade, but for the first time, the corner of her lips curved into the smallest, most fragile smile. That night, the cabin's silence felt different. Jonah sat by the fire, shaving curls from a piece of wood, while Nayeli stitched a worn glove. From time to time their eyes met, not hurried, not shying away. Between them stretched a vow unspoken, but sure whatever storms rattled outside. Within these walls, they had chosen to stand together. The road into town had never felt so long. Wagon wheels clattered over frozen earth, the morning wind cutting sharp against the skin, and Jonah Ward could feel the weight of every watching eye. He sat straight on the bench, his rough hand clasping tightly around Nayeli's smaller one. He knew the stares, the whispers, the judgment were all around them. But he also knew once you make a stand, there's no turning back. Beside him, Nayeli sat stiff at first, her shoulders tense, a plain scarf drawn over her hair. Her gaze flickered with unease, but she didn't pull her hand away. She let his grip hold firm, as if that single touch was enough to say, "We stand together." When the wagon turned onto Main Street, the murmurs grew louder. A blacksmith paused mid-swing. A mother tugged her child close. Young men leaning against the saloon porch smirked and muttered. Words drifted through the air like grit in the wind. Apache. Corn thief. He's lost his senses. Jonah ignored them. He climbed down, turned, and offered his hand. For a heartbeat, Nayeli hesitated. Then, before every set of eyes on the street, she placed her hand in his and stepped down, her head held high, not with arrogance, but with the quiet pride of someone once bound, now choosing to stand beside a man who declared, without shame, she belongs here. Together they walked into Ellison's general store. Inside, the air carried the scent of new cloth and sweet molasses. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Ellison, a widow in her 50s, sharp-eyed but not unkind. She paused at the sight of them, then inclined her head. "Morning, Mr. Ward, and good morning to you as well," she said, her voice steady. Jonah nodded, gathering rope, a hoe, a sack of flour. Nayeli lingered near, her hands clasped, eyes lowered. Then Mrs. Ellison opened a cabinet and lifted out a bolt of pale cotton fabric. "Perhaps you might want this," she asked gently. "It's easy to sew. Wears well." The room seemed to hush. Jonah glanced at Nayeli. Slowly, she reached out, fingertips brushing the fabric, and gave the faintest nod. "Mrs." Ellison smiled, wrapping it. "All right then. Fair price. No scorn, no sneer. Just a simple act." Yet in that moment, Jonah felt a door shift open. If one person in town could look at Nayeli and see a woman, not a problem, then maybe others could follow. When they stepped back onto the street, the cold wind still blew, but the stairs no longer cut as deep. Curiosity remained. Suspicion lingered, but the air carried hesitation too, as if folks were already learning to live with what they'd seen. Jonah walked steady beside Nayeli, his hand tightening over hers. It was no longer just protection. It was a vow, we carry this together. That afternoon, as the wagon rolled home under a slant of golden sun, Nayeli no longer shrank back as she had on the way in. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the wide land stretching before them. Her hand stayed in Jonah's, and this time, it was she who pressed his fingers first. That night, the cabin glowed warm. Jonah set the flour sack down, then saw the cotton bolt placed neatly on the table. Nayeli smoothed it carefully with her hands, as though it were something precious. He sat, whittling at a scrap of wood, but his eyes strayed toward her, catching the faint line of a smile at her lips. He knew then that what they had done wasn't simply buying supplies. It was a declaration Nayeli had walked into town, not as an outcast, but as herself. And by taking her hand before the eyes of everyone, Jonah had spoken louder than words. She stays. This is her home. The world will learn to accept it. The night wind rattled softly at the shutters, but it no longer felt like threat. It was only wind passing a house that was warming, a house where two souls now sat by the same fire, their hands having already met before the whole world. Winter finally loosened its grip. Ice melted from the rail fences, the ground softened, and the faint scent of fresh grass carried on the wind. Jonah Ward, a man who had built his life on solitude, began to realize his cabin was no longer the heavy, silent place it once had been. It had changed. There was the quiet sweep of a broom each morning, the curl of cooking smoke each evening, and the steady gaze of dark eyes following him as he stepped across the porch. The bond between him and Nayeli hadn't been born of sweet words, but out of countless days lived side by side, sharing salt, work, and silence. Once he brought her a pair of old boots, reshaped to fit her feet, Another time. He found in a chest his late wife's hair comb and set it on the table near the mirror. Nayeli didn't speak, but her hand lingered over the comb, and she gave him the smallest nod, as though accepting the gift not of an object, but of recognition. One chilly spring afternoon, Jonah returned from the pasture to see his cabin lit with golden lamplight, the scent of stew drifting out. He stood at the doorway, watching Nayeli move about the stove, hair unbound, skirt brushing her ankles. And in that moment he understood he wasn't walking into a house anymore. He was walking into a home. Closeness came gradually, like spring pushing through frozen ground. They began eating at the same table instead of across the room. When he carved wood, she sewed nearby. Their eyes met more often now, without flinching. One stormy night, with firelight flickering, Jonah placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't draw back. She lifted her face instead, and in her gaze Jonah saw what he had thought lost forever trust. Then came the day Nayeli stepped forward, guided his rough palm to rest on her belly. She spoke only 3 words, barely more than a whisper. "There is life." Jonah froze. In that instant, years of loss surged back the wife he buried, the infant son he never held. But instead of grief, something new rose in him, sharp and trembling joy. He held her close, his calloused hands pulling her against him, feeling life stirring beneath his palm. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I never thought I'd get this chance again." Nayeli didn't answer, only rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat thunder like it hadn't in years. After that day, Jonah looked at everything with new eyes. The corral needed to be sturdier, the fence posts stronger, and the cabin, his old, weather-beaten cabin, would need space for a cradle. He began cutting extra wood, sawing boards, picturing a small hand one day curling around his finger. Nayeli, who once moved silently through her chores, now hummed as she cooked, songs in Apache, soft as meadow wind. Jonah didn't know the words, but he knew the meaning: hope, and new life filling their home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky burn red with sunset, Jonah removed his hat and turned to her. "When planting's done, I'll take you into town. We'll see the preacher. Make this right. No one will have cause to speak against us again." Nayeli studied him a long moment, then smiled faintly, her warmth as steady as the fire inside him. "Yes," she said. From then on, the cabin glowed with a peace Jonah had never known. At night he lay in bed, listening to Nayeli's breathing beside him, listening to the wind against the shutters without dread. And in his mind's eye, he saw the future clear a hearth with fire, laughter in the air, and soon the sound of a newborn's cry. After years of living with silence and shadows, Jonah Ward had finally found hope not in glory, not in land, but in this simple home, where an Apache woman had sown in him the seed of happiness and new life. Spring spread across the valley like a fresh-woven quilt. The ground softened. Damp earth mixed with the scent of new grass, and the air was full of bird call, a season of beginning again. For Jonah Ward, this spring was unlike any he had ever known. He had lived through many turnings of the seasons, but never before with eyes that saw home, companionship, and a future worth building. At dawn, he stepped out of the cabin and found Nayeli kneeling by the garden rows, dropping seeds into the furrows he had cut the day before. Sunlight lay across her dark hair like a ribbon of fire. She glanced up, smiled softly, and went back to her work. Jonah stood watching her for a long moment, overcome by the simple peace of it. It was not the fire of passion or the ache of grief, just the steady joy of seeing life renewed in the soil and in themselves. Each afternoon they carried lumber together, set fence posts, and shored up the barn against the rains to come. Jonah felt his body come alive again. Work no longer meant survival alone, it meant building for tomorrow. And each night, sitting on the porch watching smoke curl from the chimney, he realized the cabin was no longer a shell. It was a home. Nayeli, once bound and trembling, now moved with quiet command. She sewed new patterns into the curtains, simmered stews that filled the cabin with warmth, and each evening her soft Apache songs drifted through the lamplight like prayers. These were not the sounds of a servant. They were the songs of rebirth. One night, as firelight played across the rafters, Jonah turned to her. His voice was low, steady, but resolute. "When planting's done, I'll take you into town. We'll stand before the preacher. Make it right. I want the world to know you're my wife. No one else will ever question it." Nayeli was silent for a long breath, then nodded. In her eyes shone both relief and pride, not pride at being claimed, but at being honored, openly, with dignity. The days that followed were filled with labor and laughter. Jonah planed rough boards for the fence, already picturing the cradle he would soon build. Nayeli bent over the rows, coaxing tender shoots from the ground, her hands sowing not just seed, but future. And sometimes, when they sat side by side in the fading light, they both knew without speaking, this was not merely farming. This was the planting of a life together. The townsfolk, who once whispered, grew quieter. They saw Jonah unchanged in his work, saw Nayeli cause no harm saw. Instead, the cabin's windows glowing at dusk and smoke rising steady from its hearth. Even Mrs. Ellison, behind her counter, greeted them kindly, offering bolts of cloth and small courtesies. Like gentle spring rain, the old suspicion began to wash away. One evening, with the scent of young grass in the air, Jonah laid his hand over Nayeli's. "You see," he said quietly, "this house was once only a shelter, but now it has breath, laughter, you." And soon, a child's cry. Her eyes filled with light, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. No more words were needed. In that peace, Jonah knew he had come full circle through loss, through silence back into life again. No longer only a rancher or a soldier of yesterday, but a husband, a father, a keeper of a home. And to you, listening now, I want to pause a moment. What do you think of Jonah, a man who lost everything, yet chose to open his heart, to defend what he loved, and to plant hope again? If you believe his journey deserves to be honored, tap that like button so more folks can hear this Western story. And tell me in the comments, should Jonah simply keep to his ranch and family now? Or should he stand before the town and demand greater respect for Nayeli? I promise you this in the days ahead. We'll see the answer. Because once a man has found a true home, he won't easily surrender it not to storm, nor gossip, nor the weight of old prejudice. But that, my friends, is a tale for another time.